Okay, I'm going to admit all, and then we'll give 1 minute or so for folks to get on audio. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are giving 1 more minute for everyone to get their audio set up and to come into the meeting. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, I think we have quorum here, so I recommend we go ahead and get started. So over to the Undersecretary.
Thank you, Abby, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to have you all here. My name is Catherine Antos, and I'm the Undersecretary for Decarbonization and Resilience here at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So in a nutshell, that means I lead the teams at EEA that do 2 things. First is how do we slash our greenhouse gas emissions so that we can be net zero by 2050 and cut our emissions in half by 2030 so that we can stave off the worst impacts of climate change. And then second, how do we build resilience to the impacts of climate change that we are already experiencing? And certainly in the past couple of weeks, we've seen some very stark reminders of how our country is experiencing those impacts of climate change. And we know that those impacts are only going to become more severe in the years, in decades ahead. Though, again, if we slash our emissions, if we can show the world how it can be done, we can stave off those worst impacts. So a key part of how we do our resilience work in terms of building the resilience to those impacts of climate change really has to do with this project that we are here to talk about today. And I'm so glad that you are joining us in this important conversation. This is about developing climate resilience metrics for Massachusetts. And metrics are not something that have been applied as much in the resilience front. It's a lot simpler when you look at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but in terms of resilience, it's more complex because it is about how do we reduce the damages from disasters? How do we compare that to what would be if we didn't have these measures in place? How do we think about social resilience? So certainly it's a more conversation, and I'm proud to say that we are on the leading edge of that conversation, that nationally other states and the U.S. Climate Alliance are looking with great interest at what we're doing. We're also working with the White House on it. Being part of the leading edge means that we don't have an easy playbook to follow, which is why we are so lucky to have you all here today to inform the work that we're doing, to hear about what we're doing, but really help to inform the work that we're doing so that we can make this project as strong as possible. So Massachusetts is not a stranger to being a leader to climate resilience planning and action. And what these ResilientMass metrics are going to allow us to do is also, more importantly, to learn from our progress in terms of building resilience to the impacts of climate change. So what I mean by that is, how are we making our people, our built infrastructure, our natural resources, our economy, our state and local governments more resilient to climate impacts? Where are we ahead? Where are we on track? Where are we falling behind? And when we look at areas where we are falling behind, what challenges are causing that to happen? So then based on that learning, how do we prioritize our programs, our policies, our resources to address priority actions and increase resilience to the impacts of climate change? And then the state, we're not in this alone. It's also how do we coordinate and assess and work with our public entities, our local government partners, also the private sector with community groups, to really look at the action that they are leading on climate resilience. And so that's why this Resilient Mass Metrics tool is important, not just for the state, for us learning from and informing our own work, but also it's really important for you to have a voice in the shaping of this effort, because you are the key partners in this work. And it is a way for us to collectively understand the progress that we're making. The Resilient Mass Metrics project is a priority action of the Resilient Mass Plan, which is our statewide hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan that was adopted 1 year ago by Governor Healy and approved by FEMA. So similar to the Resilient Mass Plan, the Metrics project encompasses a whole of state government approach to resilience. So again, I want you to be thinking about, how does this work inform what the state is doing, not just within EEA, but within our other secretariats as well, and how we work with you in advancing climate resilience? We are aiming to identify a reasonable set of metrics that are both meaningful and also implementable. And so when I say implementable, that can mean what are some metrics that we would be able to implement immediately. For example, every year we put out a climate report card, and our next one will be coming out in December. And so we anticipate that some of these Resilient Mass Metrics will show up for the first time in this year's climate report card. Others are going to take a little more time as we make sure we have the right data and we have baselined it appropriately. And your input today is going to help us to define the most impactful resilient metrics for Massachusetts. As you're going to see and get a chance to talk more about, we have a really great list of and a long list of things that we could be tracking and how that relates to our indicators and our resilience goals. And we really need to hear from you what you see as being the most impactful in this space. So I want to thank you for your participation, and more so, I want to thank you for your partnership in this effort to build resilience across Massachusetts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our project manager and Assistant Secretary for Resilience, Maya Mansfield.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. We greatly appreciate your time and your input. Our agenda today, we have an action-packed couple of hours for you. Please stick with us as long as you can. We're going to review some of the context for this project and for building resilience metrics within our overall climate resiliency work at the state. We'll recap our progress to date and where we are headed. We had a public meeting in the spring. This is our second and final public meeting. We'll share our proposed draft metrics and framework, and we'll spend a lot of our time in breakout groups by sector so we can really dive into proposed metrics within one sector and discuss prioritization, which are more important and why. Next, please. I also wanted to, sorry, before we go too much farther, I wanted to introduce the other members of the project management team that are on the call. And just in the interest of time, I'll let you know their names and they can wave. But Emily Dahl, our co-project manager, Emily Murad, our MVP fellow, Kara Runston, the MVP director, Sula Watermulder, our GIS climate specialist, and Krishana Abraham Petri, who's our environmental justice program manager. So thank you all for all of your work on this project. So back to this slide, this effort is really building on a series of documents and plans over the last few years that are helping us to define the challenge of climate change resilience in Massachusetts and our action plan and path forward over the coming years. So the climate assessment a couple years ago first defined the climate impacts that the state will be facing by sector and for 7 different regions. These were determined by the magnitude of impact of the climate hazard, who it was affecting and the disproportionate impact on environmental justice communities, and then the adaptation gap, or where were we seeing the need for more action. With these prioritized climate impacts, we developed the ResilientMass Plan, which is the FEMA mandated state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan that the state updates every 5 years and develops an agency action strategy to address those core impacts. Within that plan, one of the priority statewide actions was the development of a resilient mass metrics framework to articulate and guide and track our progress in implementing this plan and when we update it every 5 years. So that is what we are doing now. And these metrics are going to help define and inform future updates of the Resilient Mass Plan and really help guide our agency action strategy and also our priorities within MVP and other Resilient Mass programs. As Catherine mentioned, we also intend to report on a subset of these metrics annually through the climate report card, and then a broader set through an online dashboard that is still in development. Next, please. So from the climate assessment and the Resilient Mass Plan, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, these are some of our key climate change hazards in Massachusetts: increases in heat, general warming, as well as more frequent days with extreme heat temperatures, flooding in rivers, as well as backups and overwhelmed drainage systems, drought, storms and extreme weather, and sea level rise, which can result in permanent flooding as well as increase in flooding at high tide events. So these are some of the key hazards that are guiding all of this work and the impacts that we're feeling across the state, and now the metrics framework to guide our progress and moving the needle on these issues. Next, please. Another image from the climate assessment and Resilient Mass Plan, which identified how these priority impacts were affecting different parts of the state in different ways, and where we were seeing common impacts across the state and across regions. Next, please. And then the Resilient Mass Plan released last fall, which identified the specific strategies and actions that agencies are taking to advance progress on these core issues. And progress on this plan is tracked online on our Resilient Mass Plan action tracker. I encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. We're just going through an annual update process now to update those actions. And the metrics that we're discussing today all flow from this framework around core impacts to the state and how we identify our progress in addressing those. So with that, I want to thank you all again for your time today. Here again are the priority impacts from the climate assessment, and I will turn it over to Jackie, who is our lead on the consultant team, to help us walk us through where we are at in the project and move us to the breakout groups. Thanks, Jackie.
Great. Thanks, Maya. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Wilworth. I'm working with Industrial Economics, and we're supporting the state on this effort, along with a consultant team that you may get to meet in smaller groups in the breakout rooms today. So I think before we dive in, we just wanted to kind of take a step back. Some of this may be refresher for those of you who are at the first meeting, but we wanted to kind of think about why are we measuring progress and what do metrics give us? Why do we develop metrics? There are many different purposes for metrics. And so what we're trying to do right now is to identify the metric set that can kind of serve these purposes in the best way. So you might use metrics for communication and public engagement, sort of as a rallying cry around a common goal, for deliberate planning and decision-making, kind of targeted actions and prioritizing actions within climate resilience. They can be used to justify adaptation expenditures. You know, we know maybe how much we're spending and we can see sort of the outcome of that spending. Relatedly, they can be used for accountability and good governance. And then finally, to support learning and adaptive management. So perhaps we can tell we're doing certain activities, but we're really not seeing the outcome on the ground from those. So we have to learn and adapt and try new strategies to really move the needle. So as we go forward and we think about prioritizing the metrics we'll share with you, just kind of keep these in mind. What would the metrics be used for in your mind? And when you're rating a particular metric, as this one seems really helpful for me, you know, what kind of use are you intending or envisioning for that metric? We also talked about in our previous meeting what makes good metrics. There's a couple of different aspects of good metrics shown on the slide here. So the development process is really important to define the purpose and the goals that we're working for, and to have users, stakeholders engaged in the process. So we've taken, you know, this calendar year so far and are still in this progress of really working with stakeholders to identify the important goals and metrics that we want to include in this this Resilient Mass Metrics framework. Implementation is something we're also thinking a lot about. We want to make sure that we have a metric set that is feasible and sustainable for upkeep, as well as, available and digestible from the public. We'll talk a bit more about these indicator types in a moment. There are many different ways that metrics can measure progress. So we want to kind of keep a variety of different ways of measuring progress in our metric set to capture these different dimensions. We'll also talk about the equity focus within this framework. Key here is that it's sort of people-centered and that we're able to identify how progress is occurring both equitably and statewide as part of two, equal and primary goals. We will also talk a little bit in future phases about the baselines and targets that are associated with these metrics. And then, as Maya mentioned, we're also thinking forward to how this will be reported out in some sort of dashboard, again, that is digestible, where people can find the information that's most relevant to them. So the metrics that we'll be talking about today are focused on state actions towards climate resilience. So the two kind of underlined pieces of that statement, we're talking about state actions, though you'll notice that some of the metrics cover outcomes that are broader than strictly straight state actions. And that's because the state is interested in seeing how, what state actions are doing in terms of more broad outcomes. And so that's part of why you all are here as participants and active engagers in that kind of broader outcome. We also are focused here on climate resilience. Resilience can mean a lot of different things in many different contexts. And what we're trying to focus on here today is a bit more strictly related to the climate connection with resilience. So how can Massachusetts prepare for, adapt to, and recover from the risks of climate change? So today we are looking for you all to share your feedback. Are the metrics that we're tracking here, are they tracking meaningful actions and outcomes for state-led resilience progress? If the state is tracking the set of metrics that we're talking through today, do you think that's the right things to be measuring to make sure the state is on the right track? We also invite you to consider how these metrics could be applicable in your own community, organization, wherever sort of you're coming from today. As I said, these are focused on state actions, but they involve a broader participation across many different groups. And so like to think about how they apply to what you're doing. And then finally, they could also provide a template for tracking your own resilience progress. Perhaps municipalities or regions or other groups might be interested in tracking some of these at an even finer spatial level. And that could be really interesting if that happens kind of at a broad scale. So before we dive into the metrics, just a couple of definitions that we'll be using today. And so we can all kind of be on the same page about that. First, we talk a lot in this work about environmental justice and other priority populations. And when we talk about that kind of group, that definition includes environmental justice populations, which are determined according to the definition in Massachusetts statute. It also includes people and communities either identified geographically or by shared characteristics who may be disproportionately impacted by climate change, and therefore groups we really want to focus on and make sure we can identify progress for those groups specifically going forward. It also includes tribal nations and indigenous peoples. The other definition here to note, I kind of went over this, but just have it in writing. When we talk about climate resilience, what we're talking about is the ability to prepare for, recover from, and adapt to, or even transform to meet increased climate change impacts. Next, what are shown here are sort of the elements of the ResilientMass framework that we'll be walking through today. Our work is organized into 8 sectors. So those are sort of the highest level category in this framework. These are groupings of goals, indicators, metrics, kind of everything going down this list that address similar themes. And we'll talk a little bit about what those are and how they interact in a moment. We just spoke about the environmental justice and other priority populations definition on the previous slide. We have goals, which describe what a Massachusetts resilient to climate change would look like. And these goals were a part of the earlier engagement that we had to work with public meeting as well as state agencies and an equity advisory group that we're working with to define these goals. For each of those goals, we've also identified several indicators, which are statements that could point to or indicate success or progress. And these often include a direction. So, you might want more of this or less of that, or increase this measure, decrease that measure. Finally, we have the metrics. And so that's what we'll be focusing on today. And that's sort of where our work is going forward on the metrics. And metrics are measurable quantitatively or trackable qualitatively, outcomes or other sorts of tracking pieces that represent an indicator or multiple indicators. And so these metrics kind of nest back up this ladder of terms here. And what we're going to do today is kind of think about these sector by sector and talk through how they best represent the goals for each sector and address concerns for the environmental justice and other priority populations in the sector, as well as statewide. So just to, again, kind of give a little bit of context on how we got here today, we have gone through this process, going through each of those elements that I just walked through. We defined the sectors. We worked to define goals within each of these sectors with input from the Equity Advisory Group and state agencies. We talked about and defined indicators and these environmental justice and priority populations in the first public meeting, along with meetings with the other stakeholder groups. We identified strategies that the state is currently doing to address each of these goals, and that was through an effort with the state agencies. We then drafted the metric set that we'll be working with today. And then where we are right now is in this prioritize and refine metrics phase. So as we've sort of alluded to, we have quite a list of metrics at this point. And so what we're hoping for this month is to learn from you all and the other groups that we're engaging with this month on which of these metrics are really speaking the most to what we want to be tracking in terms of progress towards resilience in the state. After we get this list, which we're hoping to get somewhere down around, 30-ish, to be determined exactly how many, but just as sort of a rough magnitude to keep in mind. We're going to be collecting data on those metrics and providing baselines for each of those metrics. So we'll know sort of who will be able to collect this data going forward, where are we starting at now? Some of that will be for reporting in the climate report card, which we've just heard about. And some of that will be kind of building upon that initial set going forward. So again, just to kind of really put a fine point on this, today what we're trying to do is to identify the most important metrics per sector. We want to know in the near term, what can we track and report now? And we have some information on data availability, so we can start there and say, this is what we have now. Which of these are the most important to start tracking and reporting right now? And then we can also think about the most important metrics for the longer term. Where should we prioritize future data collection efforts to fill in the story of Massachusetts climate resilience building? So I've talked about these sectors before, and so we have them written out here. There are sort of 7 sectors in these petals around the outside, and then the environmental justice, equity, and collaboration sector in the middle. The important thing to note about these sectors is that although we have them defined to kind of keep things organized across all of the different metrics we're thinking about, there's really a lot of interaction and overlap across all of these sectors. If we're meeting certain goals in the natural environment sector, that's going to affect our health sector outcomes as well. Same with the economy, housing, these all are very related to each other. So as we go through the metrics, you may hear your facilitators say, yes, that's a good point. We actually have a metric about that in a different sector, and they sort of all feed into each other. The other thing to note about the sectors is that we have this environmental justice, equity, and collaboration sector right in the middle, and that's because that's going to really connect with each of the other petal sectors, I guess you could say, in this diagram. I'll talk about this in a moment on the next slide, how exactly we both integrate and call out specifically the environmental justice, equity, and collaboration sector. So the first way we do this in kind of doing this integration of equity and environmental justice in the framework is in a cross-cutting manner. So in all of the key sectors, we can track progress specifically for environmental justice and priority populations to make sure progress is being made equitably. So here we have an example from the natural environment sector where we have a draft metric that is % of households with public open space within a half mile of home. In addition to measuring that at a statewide level, we can also measure this specifically for defined environmental justice and priority populations. Here we have an example of measuring it for environmental justice communities. And when we do that, we can then report and track kind of how progress is being made both statewide and for the priority populations. The second way that equity and environmental justice is in the framework is as its own focused sector. The 8 goals underneath that sector are listed here. And there will be a group in our breakouts later today who will be focused specifically on this sector. Okay, one last thing that I'll leave you with before we go and get introduced to the breakout rooms and activities. There are different types of metrics that provide different information. And so it's helpful to keep this in mind as you're sort of seeing the metrics as they come up. On the left-hand side of this kind of spectrum that we have here, we have metrics around adaptive capacity. These are sometimes thought of as input metrics. These are sort of really on the kind of first input side of the process. These measure things like, dollars going towards certain efforts or number of staff assigned to different efforts. These are easy to connect to resilience actions. We know, the state is doing this and we can measure that. However, these types of metrics don't necessarily say much about the effectiveness of the actions. You're putting in this much money, but you don't really know what you're getting out for that. And so while these can be really important to tell that we are making progress on the actions that we've identified, we're putting resources towards this, there is sort of another part of the story that we can gain from the other side of the spectrum, which are the outcome metrics. These may better reflect kind of the ultimate effectiveness and the ultimate goal of what we're trying to achieve here. However, they can take a longer time to show up as a change, just given kind of how long it takes sometimes for actions to result in these ultimate outcomes. And they may also be influenced by outside forces and be a little bit trickier to tie specifically to the state actions. So at the bottom here, we have an example where, maybe we can measure the dollars awarded through MVP grants to plant trees. And ultimately, we're interested in kind of human health related to high heat days. And there's a lot that's happening in between there. So having some metrics that measure the state action a bit more explicitly and some metrics that measure this ultimate outcome that we're interested in can help us paint the whole picture. So when we're talking today about, what success looks like and how we can measure it, just kind of keep in mind that there may be these different ways of getting at that, and that they each kind of have their place in this process. All right, I think I will pause here and see if there's any questions or maybe turn it to Abby to facilitate that.
Yeah, why don't we give folks a minute or so if you want to throw any questions in the chat or put up your hand, we'll gladly take them. While you're doing that, my name is Abby Fulham. I work at the Consensus Building Institute and I'm on the consulting team on this effort. So again, any questions on why this state is looking at climate resilience metrics, or how they're thinking about equity and environmental justice, or different types of metrics? This is a great time to ask. Jackie, I'm going to start walking us through the breakout room activity, and then if folks are putting questions in the chat or are finding the raise hand button, feel free. We'll come back to them before we move on. Well, here we have a question from Margarita. Do you have targets for these activities? So goals for the metrics.
I can take
Yeah,
that.
that'd be great. Yeah.
At this time, that is not sort of an explicit goal of the project to define across all the metrics. There are some that already do have targets established from other initiatives that are ongoing, or different things like that. A lot of these metrics, many are meant to align with current work that's going on at the state in different ways, and current programs that address resiliency in different ways. So where there are targets, those often come from current initiatives. But at this time, we're not setting targets across the board, but agree this is an important direction for this effort to go in the future.
Thanks, Maya. Thanks for the question. I think I saw a hand from Courtney, but then it went down.
It was a mistake. Sorry.
Okay.
With the mouse.
Not a problem. Thanks, Courtney. Okay. All right. So again, I'm going to start describing what we're about to do, but if you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat and we'll come back to them. So we are going now to turn to the feedback portion of this meeting, really with kind of two big requests. One is we need your advice in helping prioritize metrics within each of the sectors. And as was shared before, we're looking to go from a long list of climate resilience metrics to an initial list of roughly 30 or so metrics for all 8 sectors. So that means like 3 to 5 metrics per sector, which is why we need your help with this prioritization process. And then second, we're looking for your input in developing prioritization criteria, which will help guide future prioritization work around metrics. And so we're going to do this in breakout groups by those 8 sectors that are on this screen. And then we will work through a prioritization exercise to get to that short list. And we're going to try to do it in digestible chunks. Jackie, if you wouldn't mind taking us to the next slide. So we have divided the metrics for this purpose, or for this activity, into 2 different categories, basically. So on the in the rows, we've divided the metrics by data availability. And so in that first green row on the top are metrics for which we have data available right now and we could implement today. The yellow row below that are metrics that have data that's partially available and that they could be implemented in the medium to near term. And then lastly, that blue row on the bottom are metrics for which the state does not yet have data, nor necessarily processes to even collect that information. That said, some of the ideas that we've heard about metrics in this category tell us something really important about the climate resilience of the sector, and this could be important for the state to prioritize for longer term implementation. Then we've also divided the metrics into type, which Jackie was just previewing, the adaptive capacity, action and output metrics, and then outcome metrics all the way to the right. And so in our breakouts, we're going to ask you to use an online poll to prioritize metrics within each data category. And then we're going to ask you to share verbally why you rated metrics high or low. And that why is really important to the project team. And we're going to invite you to, be on camera to speak openly. We really are looking for your input and really want this to be an interactive session. And then lastly, we do have a question sharing prioritization criteria that we're thinking about right now and ask for your input on that. Okay, and I think with that, we are ready to go into breakout rooms. And so in just a minute, my colleague Charlotte Goodman is going to open up the breakouts. You will get an option to choose which sector you want to discuss. And so you'll get the pop-up, click on the sector you want, and then we'll go into those rooms for about 45 minutes, at which point we'll come back into the plenary to share next steps. Okay, with that, I think we're ready, Charlotte. Thank you.
Maybe there was a question about whether there's just one breakout session.
Yeah, Megan, we are doing just one breakout room today. We have tried to keep these activities very brief, and we can only get them to 45 minutes per sector because there's so much to walk through here. And so we figured it made more sense to try to go really deep on one sector than try to very briefly go across many. Yeah. And as Jackie noted, they're all interrelated too, so that becomes challenging as you'll see. Okay. All right, Charlotte. Hey, welcome back, everyone. Give folks a second to come back into the main room. Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time in those small groups. And thanks for your patience. We had some quite small groups and some quite large groups, so it's kind of hard to perfectly align the timing on there. So thanks everyone for your patience. Jackie, when you have a second, would you be able to pull up our next step slides? Great. So we just wanted to share a bit about what's coming next for this ResilientMass Metrics initiative. So right now in October, so we have had this public meeting to get your input on metric prioritizations. We are also meeting with this project's equity advisory group and state agency partners to run through a similar exercise. The team will be then developing the initial list of metrics. In November, we will meet again with some of the state agency partners and some external partners to really talk through the data needed and confirming measurements, and then also starting to develop those baseline measurements for the initial roughly 30 metrics. And then in December, the team will be preparing recommendations for implementing the remaining priority metrics, and then release a smaller subset of metrics in the 2024 annual climate report card, which will be followed by a fuller set of metrics. Okay, and so we really appreciate your input today. And with that, I think I'm turning over to Emily Dahl for closing words.
Yes, and thank you, Abby. Thank you to our entire consultant team for your excellent facilitation of the meeting and the breakout rooms. Thank you so much to all of you for taking this extended amount of time out of your busy schedules to be with us and to provide your input, which is so important for us to hear and incorporate into our set of metrics. We are really looking forward to sharing the metrics with you and to seeing how you in your organizations can find them relevant and see where they might be implementable in different ways for you. We heard in the natural resources breakout a few examples of how these could be useful in providing regional or topical data to your different organizations. So thank you again, and we will be in touch as the metrics are released.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks all for joining. Have a lovely afternoon and evening.
I'm actually, as we lose people,
Oh,
we
right.
have decided that if folks do want to contribute to other sectors, we're going to leave the polls open just for this evening. And so I'm putting those in the chat right now. And if there was another one you wanted to contribute to, since we're wrapping up a little bit earlier than planned, please feel free to do that. So it will be in just 1 second, but they will be closing today.
And we can also email that to the attendees. We might have to make sure that those are set to be survey if they're not already.
Okay.
That's correct.
So it might take, we'll send an email to everybody who attended, how about, because we've got to sort of flip a switch in each of those, but yes, happy to.
Adaptation important and sometimes messy. So we will
Great.
follow up very quickly with that. Great,
Thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
all.
all.